Ancient Egypt was a land built on order, a civilization that worshipped balance, justice, and divine harmony. Yet beneath its temples of gold and monuments of eternity lay a truth far darker than the myths carved into stone. For a world that believed every act echoed into eternity, punishment was not just about law, it was about the soul. To defy the pharaoh was to defy the gods themselves, and for such crimes, mercy was considered blasphemy. The Egyptians believed that chaos, once unleashed, could infect the afterlife, and so their justice had to be absolute, terrifying, and unforgettable. From the royal courts of Memphis to the shadowed prisons along the Nile, there existed punishments that were not simply meant to end life, but to erase the sinner from memory, to make their spirit wander forever between this world and the next. These acts were not born from cruelty alone, but from fear. The fear of disorder, of betrayal, of divine wrath. Each sentence was a ritual, a declaration that the gods were watching and that the scales of Ma'at, the sacred balance of truth, would always find their weight. To live in Egypt was to walk a thin line between devotion and damnation, where even the whisper of treachery could summon the hand of divine punishment. And though millennia have passed, the echoes of that ancient fear still cling to the sands, whispering that no empire, no matter how radiant, ruled without blood beneath its crown. In the heart of the Nile Valley, long before empires rose and fell, Egypt was not merely a kingdom. It was a belief system carved into stone. Every sunrise was divine, every word sacred, every breath a gift from the gods. Law was not made by men, but by the will of heaven, personified through Ma'at, the goddess of balance, truth, and cosmic order. Her feather determined the worth of every soul, and her silence was more powerful than any decree. The pharaoh, the living god on earth, was her voice. To question his rule was to disturb the universe itself. In this world, crime was not viewed as an act against society, but as an infection against divinity, a fracture in the harmony that kept the sun rising and the Nile flowing. Justice, therefore, was not simply about correction. It was purification. Every trial, every sentence, every punishment carried spiritual weight. A thief did not merely steal, he disrupted the sacred order. A murderer did not just take a life. He unbalanced the scales of the afterlife. Priests, scribes, and judges, known as seers of Ma'at, gathered in solemn chambers where papyrus scrolls and incense thickened the air. Their judgments pronounced not with anger, but with ritual precision. Punishment was not vengeance, it was restoration. Yet in restoring balance, Egypt often crossed into cruelty, believing pain could cleanse sin. Those condemned were not simply punished. They were offerings, reminders to the living that chaos could not be tolerated. The walls of Thebes and Memphis once echoed with proclamations of divine law, carved deep so that no generation could forget. He who disturbs Ma'at, the inscriptions warned, disturbs the order of heaven. For common citizens, the laws were both terrifying and comforting, a reminder that their fate was bound to the same cosmic rhythm as the gods. But for those in power, law was also a weapon. Pharaohs and priests wielded divine justice not only to preserve balance, but to secure obedience. The image of Ma'at's feather adorned temples, thrones, and courtrooms alike, a symbol of fairness and a threat. To defy the order was to face more than death. It was to lose eternity. Punishment was meant to do more than harm the body. It was meant to scar the soul, ensuring the condemned could never reach the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise. As centuries passed, the rituals of law became more elaborate, and so did the punishments. Each act of retribution grew not from hatred, but from the conviction that divine order required proof, that for balance to be restored, the gods must witness suffering. Thus, in the name of harmony, Egypt built systems of pain so refined that even the sands seemed to hold their secrets. Justice in Egypt was not blind. It saw everything, weighed everything, and demanded payment from both the flesh and the spirit. Among all offenses in ancient Egypt, none were feared more than the crime of sacrilege, a violation not against man, but against the gods themselves. To steal from a temple, to defile a sacred image, or even to speak falsehood in the name of a deity, was considered the ultimate corruption of Ma'at, a wound upon the world that could not easily heal. Egypt's temples were not mere places of worship. They were living embodiments of divine order, microcosms of the universe where gods and mortals met through ritual and offering. Each brick, each symbol, each vessel of incense was thought to hold spiritual energy. To harm it was to unbalance creation itself. The priests, guardians of these sanctuaries, were not just servants but watchful judges, the eyes of the divine upon the mortal realm. When a man or woman was accused of defiling the holy, the trial was not held in a common court. It was conducted within the temple, under the gaze of colossal statues that loomed like silent witnesses. The accused stood barefoot before the altar, surrounded by priests who read from papyrus scrolls older than the dynasty itself. Evidence was not measured by logic but by omens, by the movement of sacred oil, the sway of a flame, or the pattern left by water upon sand. To lie under such judgment was to lie before the gods, a risk few dared to take. Punishments for sacrilege were swift and public, meant to restore faith and order through fear. Those found guilty were often condemned to lose what they had defiled: the hand that stole, the tongue that blasphemed, or the eyes that dared to gaze upon the forbidden. Yet it was not always physical retribution that the priests delivered. Some punishments were spiritual, meant to erase the sinner from memory entirely. Names were scratched from tombs, faces chiseled off statues, stories rewritten so the soul would wander nameless through eternity. For Egyptians, this was the second death, far worse than the first. Even families of the condemned suffered, barred from burial rites, their homes shunned as cursed. In their quest to protect the divine, the priests believed they were preserving the universe itself. But each act of purification left behind a shadow, a growing reminder that even divine justice, when carried out by human hands, could become its own form of desecration. To the ancient Egyptians, animals were not mere creatures. They were vessels of divinity, embodiments of gods who walked among mortals in living form. The cat was the grace of Bastet, the ibis the wisdom of Thoth, the bull the strength of Apis. Each species was more than sacred. It was eternal, bridging the mortal and the divine. To harm one was to strike at the gods themselves, and such an act invited punishments that transcended death. In the cities of Memphis and Bubastis, temples overflowed with sacred animals tended by priests who fed, dressed, and buried them as if they were royalty. Visitors came from across Egypt to offer food, gold, and prayers to these divine beings, believing their favor could heal the sick or bless the harvest. But when one of these animals was killed, whether by malice or mistake, the entire community rose as if the sun itself had been wounded. There are papyrus records of men who, in moments of anger or fear, harmed a sacred cat, only to be seized by neighbors before the guards could arrive. They were not taken to trial but to ceremony, judged beneath the temple colonnades, surrounded by statues that seemed to watch with silent, merciless eyes. The punishment was immediate, carried out not in wrath but in devotion. For in the minds of the Egyptians, the god who had been wronged demanded balance, not vengeance. The offender became an offering, a living symbol of atonement. In some cities, the sentence was to serve in temple labor for life, cleansing altars and carrying oil as penance. In others, the judgment was final, and the name of the condemned was erased from all records, the ultimate exile from existence. Yet it was not only individuals who suffered for such transgressions. Families were marked, their homes abandoned, their children denied entry into the priesthood. Fear of divine retribution ran so deep that even accidental harm to an animal could send shockwaves through society. Travelers from distant lands often spoke with disbelief of how Egyptians wept for a dead cat as if mourning a human child, wrapping its body in linen, anointing it with oils, and burying it in tiny sarcophagi adorned with gold and lapis lazuli. These were not the acts of superstition, but of reverence, expressions of a belief that all life was sacred because all life was divine. And so Egypt's greatest kindness and its greatest cruelty were born from the same truth, that in protecting the gods who took the shape of beasts, the people learned to fear their own humanity. Even centuries later, when the temples fell silent and the statues were swallowed by sand, the mummified remains of cats, crocodiles, and falcons were found by thousands, each one wrapped in prayer, each one a whisper of a civilization that once worshipped not through mercy, but through awe. Fire, to the ancient Egyptians, was not merely destruction, it was transformation. It consumed, purified, and revealed truth. Within the heart of their temples, fire symbolized the eye of Ra, the god of the sun, whose light judged all things and burned away corruption. But in the courts of Pharaoh, that same divine flame became a weapon of justice, wielded not by gods, but by men who believed they carried divine authority. The rituals of fire and ash were among the rarest and most feared punishments in all of Egypt, reserved for crimes that defied the sacred order: treason, blasphemy, and the deliberate desecration of divine symbols. The condemned were not treated as criminals but as forces of chaos, agents of Isfet, the eternal darkness that opposed Ma'at's light. Trials for such crimes were not held in silence. They were performances of faith, witnessed by priests, nobles, and scribes, who recorded every word as holy decree. When guilt was declared, the sentence was pronounced in the name of Ra himself, and the punishment carried out at dawn, when the first rays of sunlight fell upon the earth. The condemned would be brought before a pyre built in perfect alignment with the rising sun, its flames considered the touch of divine judgment. Yet even then, ritual surrounded every act, priests chanting hymns to guide the spirit, offerings of lotus and oil cast into the blaze as symbols of purification. The act was meant not to destroy the body, but to release the soul from corruption, to allow it to face the gods cleansed of earthly sin. Families of the condemned often watched in silence, torn between grief and reverence, for to mourn too loudly was to question the gods' will. The ashes, when the ritual ended, were gathered with care, sealed in urns, and buried in barren ground beyond the city, a final exile from both the living and the dead. Some whispered that the smoke carried the spirit upward, others that it erased the soul entirely, scattering it across the desert winds. Either way, the message was clear. The gods demanded not just obedience, but surrender. These rituals were rare, but their memory lingered for generations, retold by travelers who claimed to see the faint glow of light over the sands long after the ceremony had ended. And though Egypt called it justice, those who watched understood a deeper truth, that in seeking to cleanse corruption, even the purest flame could become its own kind of darkness. Of all punishments whispered about in ancient Egypt, none were more feared or more shrouded in superstition than the tombs of the living. It was said to be the punishment of kings, not for nobles or warriors, but for those whose crimes struck at the heart of the divine order itself. Where death was seen as a passage, burial alive was a severing. A punishment meant not only to silence the body, but to condemn the soul to eternal wandering. The Egyptians believed the afterlife was a journey through gates of light, where one's heart was weighed against the feather of Ma'at. To be entombed before death was to be denied that passage, to be trapped between the worlds of flesh and spirit, unseen by gods, unheard by men. The condemned were often priests who had betrayed their temples, scribes who forged royal decrees, or guards who desecrated sacred tombs for greed. Their sentence was carried out in secret, for it was not a public act, but a ritual of cosmic reparation. Deep within the desert cliffs, beneath the carved faces of forgotten tombs, workers would hollow small chambers, barely large enough for a man to kneel. Inside, the air was heavy with incense and limestone dust, and the walls glowed faintly with torchlight, as priests painted hieroglyphs. Not prayers of passage, but curses of stillness, sealing the spirit within. When the condemned arrived, bound and blindfolded, the chamber already waited, prepared as both tomb and trial. The priests would speak the litany of silence, a chant that invoked the gods to witness and turn their eyes away, for what was to happen next was not for divine sight. Offerings of food and water were placed beside the prisoner, not as mercy, but as symbolism, sustenance for a soul that would never reach the afterlife. Once the ritual words were spoken, the entrance was sealed with stone and mud, the final block pushed into place with the steady rhythm of a heartbeat. And then, nothing. No cries, no sounds, only the desert wind sweeping across the tomb's mouth, carrying with it the last traces of the living. For the priests it was a holy act, returning chaos to the sands, restoring balance through silence. For those who heard the stories, it was a terror that haunted dreams. Travelers swore that in certain valleys, when the wind shifted just right, one could hear faint knocks beneath the earth, echoes of souls that had never found release. Generations later, when new kings rose and old tombs were unearthed, workers would sometimes uncover strange chambers beside the burial sites, empty of coffins, but not of fear. Within, they found offerings untouched, the air still heavy with the scent of myrrh. No bodies remained, only carvings scratched into the stone, prayers, apologies, or names repeated over and over, as if clung to by hands desperate for remembrance. These chambers became known as the silent cells, and even after the ritual was abolished, their existence lingered in whispers. They reminded Egypt that its greatness had been built not just on stone and worship, but on fear. The fear of losing not one's life, but one's eternity. If the tombs of the living were meant to erase a person from existence, the punishments of shame were designed to leave them visible forever, reminders of what happened when one defied divine law. In ancient Egypt, where immortality depended upon one's name and likeness, the face held power beyond the physical. To destroy it was to destroy the soul's identity, to sever the bridge between the mortal and the eternal. Thus, the faces of shame became both punishment and warning. Those condemned to this fate were not buried nor killed, they were marked. When a man was found guilty of deception, betrayal, or crimes against the pharaoh's honor, his likeness was defaced from statues and reliefs, his name erased from every inscription. It was called damnatio memoriae, though the Egyptians had no Latin name for it, only silence. For those still living, the punishment went further. The condemned were paraded through the streets with their heads shaven, their jewelry stripped, their clothing replaced with coarse linen. In a world that prized dignity and purity, humiliation was worse than death. The people turned away not out of disgust, but fear, as if shame itself were contagious. To be stripped of honor was to become invisible, to live without lineage or legacy. Yet the cruelty of this punishment was its permanence. Statues of disgraced nobles were not destroyed outright. Instead, their faces were chiseled smooth, leaving behind blank visages that seemed to watch in silence from the temple walls. Even the tombs of the condemned were altered, the eyes carved shut, the inscriptions sanded away until the stone forgot the name it once bore. The Egyptians believed that without a face, the Ka, the vital spirit, could not find its way home in the afterlife. Thus, these erased souls became wanderers, trapped between death and remembrance, their voices lost in the vastness of eternity. Yet paradoxically, their erasure became a kind of immortality. Centuries later, archaeologists uncovered walls of faceless figures, silent but enduring, their absence speaking louder than any preserved image. Each blank outline told a story of fear and faith, that even perfection, when threatened by disobedience, could be cruel in its pursuit of purity. For Egypt, shame was not punishment of the flesh, but punishment of the spirit, a declaration that disgrace should echo longer than pain. In a civilization that sought eternity through memory, to be forgotten was the final execution. There was a saying among Egypt's scribes, "To erase a name is to kill twice." For the ancient Egyptians, whose greatest fear was to vanish from memory, erasure was the cruelest fate of all. The curse did not need to be written. It was spoken through chisels and silence. Pharaohs, priests, and rebels alike fell victim to this quiet annihilation. Their images struck from temple walls, their cartouches scraped away until the stone itself seemed to mourn. The most infamous of these was Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled as pharaoh in an age when women were not meant to wear the crown. She built monuments of breathtaking grandeur, filled with inscriptions declaring her divine right to rule. Yet after her death, her successor ordered her name removed from every monument, her statues smashed, her face chiseled smooth as desert wind. To the people it was justice, to the gods it was uncertainty. For if the afterlife depended on remembrance, what became of a soul whose name no longer existed? The priests offered no answer. Over time, the curse of erasure grew beyond vengeance. It became political. Rival dynasties rewrote history by rewriting stone, turning enemies into ghosts. Even the humble, artisans, scribes, and soldiers, feared being forgotten, for to lose one's name meant to lose eternity. Tomb builders began hiding their names in secret corners, scratched beneath hieroglyphs or buried beneath paint, praying that time would remember what power sought to destroy. Ironically, it was this fear that made Egypt immortal. The same obsession with remembrance that created its monuments also preserved its ghosts. Every chiseled wall told two stories, one of glory, one of silence. And in that silence lay the echo of rebellion, for even erased names left shadows. When archaeologists uncovered Hatshepsut's temples centuries later, her name returned to the light, her story reborn from the wounds carved into stone. The curse of erasure meant to destroy her instead made her eternal. Egypt, the land that built eternity, learned that memory cannot be buried. It only waits for rediscovery. For the Egyptians, punishment did not end with death. It merely changed realms. Every crime, every lie, every betrayal of Ma'at awaited its reckoning in the Hall of Judgment, where the soul faced the gods beyond the veil of mortality. There, in a chamber of endless silence, stood Osiris, the ruler of the dead, flanked by the 42 divine judges and the feather of Ma'at, pure, weightless, incorruptible. The heart of the deceased was placed upon a golden scale, its weight compared against the feather. If the heart was heavy with sin, it betrayed the soul's deceit. If it balanced, the spirit was granted passage into the eternal fields of peace. But for those whose hearts tipped the scale, there was no mercy. Their punishment was not pain, but obliteration. The devourer goddess, Ammit, part lion, crocodile, and hippopotamus, waited beside the scale, ready to consume the unworthy heart, condemning the soul to eternal extinction. This was the greatest horror imaginable to the Egyptians. Not torment, not suffering, but the complete loss of being. Yet even here, echoes of earthly judgment lingered. Those who had been falsely condemned in life prayed that Ma'at would vindicate them in death, that truth would restore what law had taken. The priest spoke of this final balance as perfect justice, the correction of mortal errors by divine will. But for the living, the knowledge of that eternal trial shaped every law, every punishment, every fear. It was said that those who enforced cruelty in the name of balance would one day face the same scales. Their hearts weighed against the pain they inflicted. Thus, even the judges who pronounced death did so trembling, knowing their own judgment awaited beyond the tomb. The Hall of Osiris was more than myth. It was a mirror, reflecting the conscience of a civilization that built eternity from fear and faith alike. For in the end, the Egyptians believed the gods could not be deceived, and no name, no monument, no wealth could outweigh the truth of a single heart. The story of punishment in ancient Egypt is not just a history of cruelty. It is a reflection of humanity's eternal struggle between order and compassion, faith and fear. Beneath the golden glow of its temples and the majesty of its monuments, Egypt built a civilization that sought perfection through control, believing that pain could preserve purity and that fear could protect harmony. Every law, every ritual, every act of judgment was meant to defend Ma'at, the fragile balance between chaos and creation. Yet in doing so, it revealed the cost of such devotion. The priests who burned incense to purify the soul also kindled the fires of fear. The kings who carved their laws into stone ensured that mercy would erode long before memory did. But even in its harshest sentences, Egypt's heart still beat with a strange form of faith, the belief that the soul mattered, that justice reached beyond the grave, that the universe itself demanded fairness. Perhaps that is why, thousands of years later, the echoes of those rituals still move us, not because of their cruelty, but because they mirror the questions we still ask. How far will a society go to preserve order? When does punishment stop serving justice and begin serving power? Egypt, the land that measured eternity in stone and silence, left behind more than tombs and hieroglyphs. It left a lesson that justice without mercy becomes tyranny, and that fear, once worshipped, never truly dies. As the desert wind sweeps through the ruins of temples once filled with prayers, it carries not the voices of gods, but the whisper of human frailty, the reminder that even the mightiest empires were built upon the trembling hands of those who feared the darkness they tried to control.